The 24th of February, 1991, marked the moment when General Norman Schwarzkopf stood before a wall-sized map in Riyadh. Saudi Arabia, watching red arrows pierce into Kuwait like surgical strikes through flesh. The ground war had begun just hours earlier, and already the world was witnessing something unprecedented. A conflict conducted not through bloody attrition, but through technological supremacy and doctrinal revolution. What television cameras would later broadcast as Operation Desert Storm represented far more than America's response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. It signified the violent birth of a new American way of war, forged in the failures of Vietnam and tempered by decades of Cold War innovation. Schwarzkopf, a bear of a man whose temper was as legendary as his tactical mind, had spent months orchestrating what military historians would call the most lopsided victory in modern warfare. The coalition forces under his command, over 500,000 American troops joined by forces from 34 nations, faced an Iraqi military that intelligence reports estimated at over 500,000 soldiers, battle-hardened from 8 years of brutal war with Iran. Yet numbers told only part of the story. What separated these forces was not merely equipment or training, but an entire philosophy of warfare that had been revolutionized in the 18 years since American helicopters lifted desperate civilians off Saigon rooftops. The seeds of this transformation had been planted in defeat. When the last American combat units departed Vietnam in 1973, they left behind a military institution questioning its very identity. The draft had ended, bases echoed with vacancy, and morale festered like an infected wound. Officers who would later lead Desert Storm, Colin Powell, Norman Schwarzkopf, Barry McCaffrey, were junior leaders then. Watching their profession crumble under the weight of public scorn and institutional decay, they carried those lessons like scars, determined that if America fought again, it would fight differently. According to extensive documentation preserved in the National Archives and detailed in Rick Atkinson's Crusade, The Untold Story of the Persian Gulf War, published in 1993. The rebuilding began with fundamental questions about what military force should achieve in a democratic society. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 restructured the entire command apparatus, forcing services that had operated as feudal kingdoms to function as a unified force. The Airland Battle Doctrine, developed throughout the 1980s, emphasized speed, precision, and the integration of all combat arms, air, ground, and naval forces moving as synchronized instruments of national power. But doctrine meant nothing without technology to execute it. The billions poured into defense during the Reagan administration had produced a generation of weapons systems that existed more in the realm of science fiction than traditional warfare. Stealth aircraft invisible to radar, precision-guided munitions that could strike targets from miles away with near-perfect accuracy, satellite communications linking commanders to frontline units in real time, night vision technology turning darkness from concealment into tactical advantage. These weren't merely better tools. They represented a revolution in what warfare could accomplish and what costs it might exact. The 17th of January 1991 began with darkness over Baghdad, precisely 2:38 in the morning local time. The first Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from warships positioned hundreds of miles away in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea began their programmed flight paths toward Iraqi command centers, communications facilities, and air defense networks. Minutes later, F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters, invisible to Iraqi radar, dropped laser-guided bombs through the skylights of critical buildings, with a precision that would have seemed impossible in any previous conflict. The air war had begun, and with it, a demonstration of military capability that would reshape global understanding of American power. Captain Marcel Kerdavid, a French liaison officer attached to the Coalition Air Command, later described watching the air tasking orders, the daily plans coordinating thousands of sorties, witnessing an orchestra conducted by computers, where every instrument knew its precise moment to play. The complexity was staggering. Each day, over 2,000 aircraft from multiple nations flew missions requiring mid-air refueling, precise timing, and split-second coordination. Pilots navigated using GPS satellites technology, so new that many aircraft had commercial receivers duct-taped to their instrument panels. They dropped bombs guided by lasers and increasingly by GPS coordinates, transforming the ancient art of aerial bombardment into something approaching a science. Lieutenant General Charles Horner, commanded this air campaign from a basement bunker in Riyadh, surrounded by screens displaying real-time footage from aircraft, drones, and satellites. What unfolded was a systematic dismantling of Iraq's military infrastructure conducted, with a clinical precision that warfare had never before achieved. Strategic targets, leadership bunkers, communications nodes, power generation facilities, chemical weapons plants were struck repeatedly until intelligence confirmed their destruction. Iraqi air defenses, once considered among the world's most formidable, were systematically suppressed. The vaunted Iraqi Air Force, equipped with modern Soviet aircraft and battle-tested pilots, was either destroyed on the ground or fled to Iran, effectively removing itself from the conflict. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical destruction. Iraqi soldiers dug into elaborate defensive positions along the Kuwait-Saudi border, spent weeks under relentless aerial bombardment without being able to see their attackers or effectively fight back. American aircraft operated with near impunity, especially after the first week, when Iraqi air defenses had been largely neutralized. B-52 bombers, designed in the 1950s to deliver nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, conducted carpet bombing missions against Iraqi troop concentrations. Each aircraft could carry dozens of bombs, and they flew mission after mission, day and night, for 38 days of sustained aerial assault. Yet the air campaign was not without controversy or complexity. The precision weapons that dominated media coverage represented only a fraction of munitions, dropped roughly 8% according to post-war Pentagon assessments. The vast majority were conventional dumb bombs, devastating in their power but lacking the accuracy that television audiences associated with the new American way of war. Civilian casualties occurred, most notably when a laser-guided bomb struck the Amaria shelter in Baghdad on the 13th of February, killing over 400 Iraqi civilians seeking refuge from the bombardment. The incident sparked international outcry and forced difficult questions about the limits of precision warfare. Intelligence officers tracking Iraqi military capabilities through satellite imagery, communications, intercepts, and human intelligence sources began detecting signs of collapse. Iraqi units were reporting desertion rates exceeding 50% in some frontline positions. Supply lines had been severed. Command and control was fragmenting as bunkers were destroyed and communications networks interdicted. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite forces positioned in reserve, remained largely intact, but was being steadily weakened by sustained air attacks. By mid-February, coalition commanders faced the question that had been inevitable since the air campaign's overwhelming success. When would the ground war begin, and what resistance would it actually face? The 24th of February, 1991, dawned with deceptive quiet across the Saudi-Kuwait border. For weeks, Iraqi commanders had watched coalition forces mass opposite their defensive lines, elaborate networks of minefields, berms, trenches, and bunkers stretching across Kuwait's southern border. They expected the main assault to come there, a frontal attack against prepared positions that would turn the desert into a killing field, reminiscent of World War I's Western Front. Saddam Hussein had publicly declared Kuwait would become the mother of all battles, where American forces would drown in their own blood, as they had in Vietnam. Iraqi intelligence was reasonably certain they understood coalition intentions. They were catastrophically wrong. While international attention focused on the obvious attack routes, Schwarzkopf had orchestrated one of history's largest military deceptions. Over 200,000 American and Allied troops, including the entire 7th Corps with its heavy armored divisions, had quietly shifted westward into the Saudi desert, positioning themselves for a massive flanking maneuver that would bypass Iraqi defenses entirely and strike deep into Iraq itself. This left hook, as it became known, represented both tactical audacity and technological necessity. Only with satellite navigation, mobile communications, and air superiority could such a maneuver succeed across hundreds of miles of featureless desert. Marine units and Arab coalition forces did attack the prepared Iraqi defenses directly, but these assaults served primarily to fix Iraqi attention and reserves. The real war exploded across a 200-mile front as American armor poured northward through virtually undefended Iraqi desert. The 7th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Franks, Jr., advanced with over 1,500 tanks and armored vehicles in what amounted to the largest armored offensive since World War II, Their objective was the Republican Guard divisions positioned in Reserve Sodom's strategic ace, his guarantee against complete defeat. Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, riding at the vanguard of this massive assault. On the 26th of February, his unit encountered an Iraqi Republican Guard brigade dug in near a place called 73 Easting, a map coordinate that would become legendary in Army lore. What followed was a battle that perfectly illustrated the revolution in American military capability. Iraqi T-72 tanks, capable Soviet-designed weapons that had performed well in other conflicts, appeared on American thermal sights as bright images against the cool desert background. American M1 Abrams tanks and M3 Bradley fighting vehicles engaged from distances exceeding to miles, firing on the move with stabilized guns and sophisticated fire control systems. The Battle of 73 Easting lasted 23 minutes. Eagle Troop destroyed approximately 28 tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and 30 trucks without suffering a single loss. Iraqi crews, many of whom never saw their attackers, were overwhelmed by opponents who could fire accurately while moving at 30 miles per hour in darkness and blowing sand. American tanks mounted 120mm smoothbore cannons firing depleted uranium penetrator rounds that could pierce Iraqi armor like paper. Thermal imaging systems turned night into advantage rather than concealment. Digital communications linked every vehicle into a shared understanding of the battlefield that individual Iraqi units operating with Vietnam or Soviet equipment could not match. Across the theater, similar scenes unfolded. The 24th Infantry Division advanced nearly 200 miles in 4 days, moving faster and farther than any mechanized force in military history. The 1st Infantry Division breached Iraqi defenses so rapidly that prisoners overwhelmed processing capabilities. Iraqi units surrendered en masse, often signaling aircraft overhead or actively seeking coalition troops to accept their capitulation. Those Republican Guard units that stood and fought were systematically destroyed in battles where American forces held such overwhelming technological advantages that the outcome seemed predetermined. The war was not merely being won, it was being revolutionized in real time, broadcast globally through media coverage that turned tactical engagements into primetime entertainment. The 26th of February, 1991, revealed a scene that would haunt American military consciousness for decades. Along Highway 8, the primary route from Kuwait City northward toward Basra, thousands of Iraqi vehicles sat burning in an apocalyptic tableau of destruction that media would soon label the Highway of Death. Military trucks, civilian cars, fire engines, ambulances, and stolen Kuwaiti vehicles stretched in a chaotic convoy for miles, blasted and burned by relentless air attacks. Some vehicles had clearly been attempting to flee with looted goods, televisions, furniture, and other plunder visible among the wreckage. Bodies lay scattered among the destruction, though far fewer than the apocalyptic imagery suggested. Coalition aircraft had caught retreating Iraqi forces in the open and unleashed devastating firepower against targets that could not effectively defend themselves or escape. The destruction of the Iraqi convoys presented American commanders and political leaders with uncomfortable questions about the nature of victory and the ethics of overwhelming force. Were these legitimate military targets retreating soldiers who might regroup and fight? Again, or were they defeated troops, attempting to comply with coalition demands to leave Kuwait? The distinction mattered enormously, both legally and morally. Pilots reported that many vehicles were clearly military, with troops and equipment mixed among civilian vehicles. But the sheer scale of destruction, delivered against opponents who posed no meaningful threat, struck some observers as excessive, even vengeful. President George Herbert Walker Bush monitored the ground war's progress from the White House. Receiving regular updates from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, the coalition's success had exceeded even optimistic projections. Kuwait was liberated. Iraqi military power was shattered. The Republican Guard, though not completely destroyed, was in full retreat. Yet the images from the Highway of Death, broadcast globally by media embedded with coalition forces, began generating discomfort. Bush faced a fundamental question. When does victory become excessive? When does military necessity shade into disproportionate destruction? According to detailed accounts in President Bush's memoir, A World Transformed, co-authored with Brent Scowcroft and published in 1988, The decision to end combat operations was driven by multiple factors. The coalition's military objectives had been achieved. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait, and their military capability was effectively destroyed. Further prosecution of the war risked fragmenting the international coalition, particularly Arab members uncomfortable with the destruction being visited upon a fellow Arab nation. There were practical concerns about American forces advancing into increasingly complex urban terrain around Busra, where advantages in technology and mobility would diminish and casualties might mount. And there was the political calculation that Saddam's regime, weakened and humiliated, might be overthrown by internal forces without requiring a controversial American occupation. On the 27th of February, exactly 100 hours after ground operations began, President Bush ordered a ceasefire. The announcement came at 9 o'clock in the evening, Eastern Standard Time, delivered in a brief address where Bush declared that Kuwait was liberated and Iraqi military objectives were achieved. In the field, commanders received orders to halt offensive operations, secure positions, and begin accepting surrenders. The war that had dominated global attention for 6 weeks of air campaign and 4 days of ground combat was over. The speed and decisiveness of the victory stunned military analysts worldwide. The Soviet Union, watching its military equipment and doctrine systematically dismantled by American technology and tactics, accelerated discussions about military reform that would ultimately prove impossible as the Soviet state itself collapsed months later. Yet, even in the moment of triumph, complications emerged that would haunt American policy for years. The ceasefire was announced before coalition forces had completely encircled or destroyed the Republican Guard, divisions that constituted Saddam's strategic reserve. Thousands of Iraqi troops, along with substantial equipment, escaped northward into Iraq, where they would soon be employed against internal uprisings that the coalition had encouraged but would not support. The decision not to march on Baghdad, never a coalition objective, and potentially disastrous given regional politics and military realities, Saddam in power, wounded but dangerous. The question of what victory actually meant and what objectives American military power could realistically achieve remained unresolved beneath the celebration of overwhelming tactical success. The 28th of February, 1991, found Lieutenant General Barry McCaffrey's 24th Infantry Division positioned deep inside Iraq, approximately 150 miles from the Kuwaiti border. The ceasefire had taken effect the previous evening. But what happened next would illustrate the confusion and controversy that can accompany even the most successful military operations. McCaffrey's division encountered Iraqi forces attempting to withdraw from the theater according to American accounts. They fired on American positions, triggering what became known as the Battle of Rumellah. Coalition forces, employing the same devastating combination of air power and armored firepower that had characterized the entire campaign, destroyed approximately 700 Iraqi vehicles and inflicted thousands of casualties. Critics would later question whether this engagement, occurring after the ceasefire, constituted excessive force against a defeated enemy. Defenders insisted it represented legitimate self-defense against hostile fire. The controversy surrounding Rumellah highlighted a larger truth: the new American way of war, so effective at destroying conventional military forces, created its own set of moral and strategic dilemmas. American technological superiority had produced a conflict so one-sided that it challenged traditional understandings of warfare. Coalition combat deaths totaled approximately 350 personnel over 6 weeks of operations, including accidents and friendly fire incidents. Iraqi military deaths remained uncertain. Estimates ranged from 20,000 to over 50,000, with civilian casualties adding thousands more. The disparity between losses raised uncomfortable questions about whether such lopsided applications of force constituted legitimate warfare or something closer to systematic slaughter. Major General Paul Funk, commanding the 3rd Armored Division, spent the weeks following the ceasefire supervising the destruction of Iraqi military equipment that coalition forces had captured or found abandoned. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft were systematically demolished to prevent their future use. The sheer scale of destruction testified to how completely Iraqi military power had been shattered. Yet already, intelligence reports indicated Saddam Hussein was redirecting surviving Republican Guard units against internal uprisings. Shiite populations in southern Iraq and Kurdish communities in the north, encouraged by coalition rhetoric about liberating Iraq from Saddam's tyranny, had risen in rebellion, expecting American support. That support never materialized. President Bush's decision not to intervene in Iraq's internal conflicts reflected both the coalition's limited objectives and realistic assessments of what military occupation might entail. The coalition had united to expel Iraq from Kuwait, not to occupy Iraq or engage in nation-building. Arab coalition members were particularly adamant that Western forces should not occupy an Arab capital or involve themselves in Iraq's domestic politics. American military commanders, while confident in their ability to reach Baghdad, were far less certain about what occupying Iraq might require or achieve. The ghost of Vietnam haunted these discussions, the fear of being drawn into a prolonged counterinsurgency with unclear objectives and no obvious exit strategy. General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the most prominent African-American military officer in American history, articulated what became known as the Powell Doctrine during this period. Military force, Powell insisted, should be employed only when vital national interests were at stake, with clear objectives, overwhelming force, and broad public support. When force was used, it should be employed decisively to achieve specific, achievable goals, followed by rapid withdrawal. Desert Storm seemed to vindicate this approach: clear objectives achieved through overwhelming force applied decisively. Yet the doctrine's limitations would become apparent as Saddam remained in power. Regional instability persisted, and questions about America's role in the post-Cold War world became increasingly complex. The returning American troops received celebrations reminiscent of World War II's victory parades, a conscious national effort to honor Vietnam veterans by proxy through honoring this generation. Cities across America held parades, yellow ribbons, decorated trees, and lampposts. President Bush's approval rating soared above 90%. The military, so recently questioned and demoralized, was restored to a position of honor in American society. Yet beneath the celebration, thoughtful observers recognized that Desert Storm had answered some questions about American military capability, while raising others about national strategy. What were America's responsibilities as the sole remaining superpower? How should military force be employed in regional conflicts? What constituted victory when adversaries survived defeat? The 3rd of March, 1991, brought General Norman Schwarzkopf before a Pentagon briefing room packed with reporters from around the world. His presentation, complete with maps, videos of precision strikes, and a gruff, confident demeanor that media found irresistible, would become a defining moment in how Americans understood the war. Schwarzkopf walked reporters through the campaign's strategy, explaining the deception operations, the left hook flanking maneuver, and the systematic application of air power. What emerged was a narrative of American military excellence, superior technology, brilliant planning, courageous execution, and decisive victory achieved with minimal friendly casualties. It was a compelling story and largely accurate, but it obscured deeper lessons about warfare's changing nature that would take years to fully understand. The military services launched immediate efforts to analyze the conflict and extract lessons for future operations. The Army's National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, began incorporating Desert Storm scenarios into training rotations. The Air Force studied the effectiveness of precision weapons, stealth technology, and the integration of air power with ground operations. The Navy examined carrier-based aviation's role and the effectiveness of Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Marine Corps analyzed amphibious feints in urban operations in Kuwait City. Each service sought to validate its doctrines, justify its weapons programs, and position itself for the post-Cold War defense budget battles that loomed ahead. Colonel Worden, an Air Force theorist whose ideas about strategic bombing had influenced the air campaign's design, argued that precision air power could achieve strategic objectives independently of ground forces. His 5 rings model of targeting leadership, key production, infrastructure, population, fielded forces suggested that modern air campaigns could paralyze enemy nations without requiring armies to occupy territory. Critics countered that air power, while devastatingly effective against Iraq's conventional military, had failed to dislodge Saddam from power or prevent humanitarian disasters in the war's aftermath. The debate about air power's potential and limits would continue through subsequent conflicts in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The technology that had proven so effective in Desert Storm created immediate demand for expansion and improvement. Defense contractors promoted GPS-guided munitions, stealth technology, unmanned aerial vehicles, and advanced communications systems. Congress, despite pressure to collect a peace dividend after the Cold War's end, proved willing to fund weapons programs that had demonstrated clear effectiveness. B-2 stealth fighter, B-2 stealth bomber, and various precision weapons programs received continued support based on Desert Storm's validation of technological superiority as a warfighting principle. Yet the most important lessons from Desert Storm extended beyond technology. For tactics, two fundamental questions about warfare's nature in the post-Cold War era. The conflict had demonstrated that American military forces, properly equipped and led, could achieve decisive conventional victories against regional powers. But it also revealed the limits of military force in achieving broader political objectives. Saddam Hussein survived, regional instability persisted, and the necessity of maintaining forces in the Persian Gulf to contain Iraq created long-term commitments that would eventually draw America back into conflict. The question of what military victory actually achieved when adversaries survived and regional problems persisted remained unresolved. Lieutenant Colonel John Nagel, who would later become a prominent counterinsurgency theorist, was serving as a junior officer during Desert Storm. He later reflected that the military learned the wrong lessons from the conflict, focusing on conventional warfare excellence while neglecting the messier challenges of peacekeeping, nation-building, and counterinsurgency. Overwhelming success against Iraqi conventional forces created what some termed Desert Storm Syndrome, an expectation that American military power could achieve rapid, decisive victories with minimal casualties in any conflict. This assumption would be severely tested in subsequent interventions, where adversaries refused to fight conventionally and where military victory proved far easier to achieve than lasting political solutions. The 15th of January, 1991, had introduced global audiences to a new kind of war reporting when cable news network broadcasters John Holliman, Bernard Shaw, and Peter Arnett described live from Baghdad's Al-Rashid Hotel as Tomahawk cruise missiles and precision bombs struck the Iraqi capital, their broadcast continuing even after other reporters had fled to bomb shelters, brought warfare into living rooms with an immediacy that previous conflicts had never achieved. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated, Arnett intoned, his voice steady despite the violence unfolding outside. Television audiences worldwide watched tracer fire arc across night skies, explosions lighting the horizon, and anti-aircraft fire creating geometric patterns against the darkness. Warfare had become a spectator event, broadcast live with commentary. This media revolution fundamentally altered the relationship between military operations and public perception. The Pentagon, learning from Vietnam's adversarial media relations, implemented a sophisticated public affairs strategy that balanced operational security with public information demands. Reporters were embedded with military units, given unprecedented access to operations. But their reports were subject to security review, and their movements controlled. The result was coverage that generally portrayed American military operations positively, while maintaining enough independence to retain credibility. Critics argued this created a sanitized version of warfare, emphasizing technological success while minimizing human costs. The videos of precision weapons striking targets became iconic images of the conflict. Grainy black and white footage from weapons systems showed bombs entering building vents, missiles striking bunkers, and targets exploding with what appeared to be surgical precision. Smart bombs became a cultural phenomenon, representing a kind of warfare where technology reduced collateral damage and American military capability seemed almost magical. The reality was more complex. The vast majority of munitions remained conventional weapons with significant blast radiuses. But the narrative of precision warfare captured public imagination and shaped understanding of what American military power could achieve. Brigadier General Neil Blanc served as the chief military spokesman throughout the conflict, conducting daily briefings that became appointment television for millions. His presentations, featuring maps, videos, and confident assessments of coalition progress, created a narrative structure for understanding the war. Iraqi claims of massive civilian casualties were countered with evidence of precision targeting. Military setbacks were acknowledged, but contextualized within broader success. The briefings served multiple purposes: informing the public, maintaining domestic support, signaling to international audiences, and conducting psychological operations against Iraqi leadership. The line between information and propaganda became increasingly difficult to distinguish. The global media presence also created strategic complications. When the Amaria shelter was struck on the 13th of February, killing hundreds of Iraqi civilians, global media broadcast images of grieving families and burned bodies. Iraqi information minister claimed the facility was clearly a civilian shelter. Coalition officials insisted it served military command functions based on intelligence assessments. The competing narratives played out in real time across global media, forcing rapid responses from coalition leadership. President Bush, sensitive to international opinion, reportedly restricted certain targeting categories to avoid similar incidents, demonstrating how media coverage directly influenced operational decisions. Robert Weiner, a CNN producer whose experiences were later chronicled in the book Live from Baghdad, described the surreal experience of producing live television coverage while bombs fell nearby. The small CNN team in Baghdad operated with Iraqi government supervision, but maintained enough independence to provide credible reporting. Their presence created a bizarre situation where American military planners knew that Iraqi leadership and much of the world was watching their own networks' coverage of the strikes they were conducting. Warfare had become a performance art, where image management and perception shaped strategic outcomes as much as battlefield success. The 4th of February, 1991, found specialist Melissa Rathbun Neely, becoming the first American woman prisoner of war since World War II, when her truck was captured after taking a wrong turn near the Kuwait-Saudi border. Her capture, and the subsequent capture of 2 male soldiers from her unit, highlighted how the new American military, increasingly diverse and technologically dependent, meant that support units operating sophisticated equipment faced combat dangers once reserved for infantry. The visibility of women in the conflict challenged traditional gender roles and sparked debates about military service that continued long after the war ended. Major Rhonda Cornum, a flight surgeon shot down over Iraq on the 27th of February, endured 8 days of captivity that included physical abuse and sexual assault. Her experience, later detailed in her memoir, She Went to War, forced military and civilian leaders to confront uncomfortable realities about what gender integration and combat roles truly meant. Cornum herself argued against using her experience as evidence that women should be excluded from combat, insisting instead that professionalism and capability, not gender, should determine military assignments. Her courage and advocacy contributed to the eventual elimination of combat exclusion policies that had formerly barred women from direct combat roles. The 25th of February saw one of the war's most tragic incidents, when an Iraqi Scud missile struck a warehouse in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, being used as barracks for Pennsylvania Army National Guard troops. 28 soldiers died instantly, the single deadliest attack on American forces during the entire conflict. The victims were not frontline combat troops, but support personnel, mechanics, truck drivers, supply specialists performing the unglamorous but essential work that enabled high-technology warfare. Their deaths illustrated that modern warfare's lethality extended far beyond traditional battlefields, and that technological superiority provided no absolute protection against determined adversaries. Friendly fire incidents accounted for nearly a quarter of American combat deaths during Desert Storm, a disturbing statistic that revealed how technological warfare's complexity created new dangers. On the 26th of February, 2 American A-10 attack aircraft mistakenly engaged British armored vehicles, killing 9 British soldiers. The following day, American tanks fired on American vehicles during a nighttime engagement, killing several soldiers. The incidents reflected how thermal sights, long-range engagements, and rapid operational tempo created identification challenges that peacetime training had not fully addressed. The military services implemented improved identification systems and training protocols, but the fundamental tension between technological lethality and human judgment remained unresolved. Iraqi military and civilian casualties proved impossible to accurately assess, both during the conflict and in subsequent years. Iraqi government claims of hundreds of thousands of deaths were clearly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, but coalition estimates of 20,000 to 30,000 military deaths were likely too conservative. The Beth Osborne DePonte case illustrated the political sensitivity surrounding casualty counts when the Census Bureau demographer faced pressure after publishing estimates of Iraqi deaths that exceeded official Pentagon figures. Post-war studies suggested that immediate combat deaths numbered in the tens of thousands, with additional thousands dying from war-related disease, malnutrition, and infrastructure destruction in subsequent months. The psychological costs of technological warfare, though less visible than physical casualties, affected thousands of service members. Post-traumatic stress disorder cases emerged not only among infantry who engaged in close combat, but also among support personnel who witnessed death, pilots who delivered devastating firepower, and soldiers who participated in what some described as industrial-scale destruction of enemy forces. The clean technological narrative of precision warfare obscured the reality that humans still suffered, bled, and died, and that those who survived carried psychological burdens that statistics could not capture. The Department of Veterans Affairs would spend decades addressing Gulf War veterans' health issues, including Gulf War syndrome, a constellation of unexplained symptoms affecting tens of thousands of veterans whose causes remained medically mysterious. The 15th of April 1991 marked the passage of United Nations Security Council Resolution 687, establishing the terms of Iraq's ceasefire and imposing comprehensive sanctions and weapons inspections designed to prevent Saddam Hussein's regime from reconstituting its military threat. The resolution, among the most intrusive ever imposed on a sovereign nation, required Iraq to destroy all weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 150 kilometers, accept intrusive international inspections, and recognize Kuwait's sovereignty. The sanctions regime that accompanied the resolution would remain in place for 12 years, creating humanitarian consequences that complicated international support for containing Iraqi ambitions. American forces began withdrawing from the region immediately after the ceasefire. But complete withdrawal proved impossible. Iraqi suppression of Shiite and Kurdish rebellions prompted the establishment of no-fly zones in southern and northern Iraq, requiring ongoing American and coalition air presence to enforce. Operation Provide Comfort deployed American forces to southern Turkey to protect Kurdish populations from Iraqi reprisals, creating a semi-autonomous Kurdish region that would persist for decades. Operation Southern Watch established a similar no-fly zone south of the 32nd parallel, protecting Shiite populations and limiting Iraqi military operations. These commitments, initially conceived as temporary, became permanent features of American Middle East presence. General Anthony Zinni, who served as the commanding officer of coalition forces enforcing the no-fly zones in the mid-1990s, later reflected that the sanctions and containment regime created what amounted to low-intensity conflict that persisted for over a decade. Iraqi forces regularly challenged no-fly zone restrictions, requiring American and British aircraft to conduct strikes against air defense systems. Iraqi civilians suffered under comprehensive economic sanctions that restricted imports of food, medicine, and essential goods. The humanitarian costs of sanctions generated increasing international criticism, particularly from France, Russia, and China, whose commercial interests in Iraq had been substantial before the war. The containment regime succeeded in preventing Iraqi military resurgence, but failed to achieve regime change or regional stability. The Kuwait oil fires, ignited by retreating Iraqi forces in late February, burned for 8 months before being fully extinguished. Over 600 wells were set ablaze, creating environmental devastation and economic losses exceeding tens of billions of dollars. The fires produced massive air pollution, with smoke plumes visible from space and health effects felt across the region. International firefighting teams, including the famous Red Adair, worked methodically to cap the wells, but the damage illustrated how modern warfare's consequences extended beyond military destruction to environmental catastrophe with long-term regional impacts. Iraq's defeat did not stabilize the Persian Gulf region as coalition leaders had hoped. Kuwait's government, restored by American military power, moved slowly on promised political reforms. Arabia faced increasing internal criticism from religious conservatives who opposed Western military presence on Saudi soil, criticism that would eventually contribute to the rise of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda's anti-American terrorism. Iran, Iraq's historic rival, saw opportunities to expand regional influence as Iraqi power collapsed. The balance of power that Desert Storm was intended to restore remained unstable, requiring ongoing American military commitments that would draw the United States deeper into Middle Eastern conflicts. The economic costs of Desert Storm sparked debate about burden sharing among coalition partners. The United States spent approximately $61 billion on the operation, but contributions from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Germany, and other nations offset much of this cost. American taxpayers ultimately paid approximately $7 billion, remarkably small sum for such a massive military operation. This financial arrangement set precedents for future conflicts where American military power would be employed with international financial support, though the sustainability and fairness of such arrangements remained controversial. Critics argued that America was becoming a mercenary force, while supporters insisted that burden sharing appropriately distributed costs among nations benefiting from international stability. The 11th of September 2001 marked the day when 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked for commercial aircraft and attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people in the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. The attacks, planned by Osama bin Laden, partly in response to American military presence in Saudi Arabia that had persisted since Desert Storm, demonstrated that overwhelming conventional military superiority provided no protection against asymmetric threats. The warfare revolution that Desert Storm represented precision strikes, technological dominance, rapid conventional victory, proved irrelevant against adversaries who operated outside conventional military frameworks. America's military, so perfectly designed to destroy Iraqi armor in the desert, would spend the next 2 decades struggling against insurgents in Iraqi cities. The invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 and Iraq in March 2003 initially seemed to validate Desert Storm's lessons. American forces, employing air power, special operations, and local allies, rapidly overthrew the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq featured a mechanized offensive that reached Baghdad in 3 weeks, deposing Saddam Hussein's regime with fewer than 200 American combat deaths. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other civilian leaders touted these victories as evidence that military transformations, smaller forces leveraging technology for rapid, decisive operations, had succeeded. Military officers who had led in Desert Storm, including General Tommy Franks, who commanded both Afghanistan and Iraq operations, applied doctrines developed a decade earlier. But rapid conventional victory proved vastly different from achieving political objectives or establishing lasting stability. Iraq descended into sectarian violence and insurgency that killed thousands of American troops and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis over the next 8 years. Afghanistan became America's longest war, continuing for 2 decades without achieving lasting victory. The counterinsurgency campaigns required in both nations demanded skills, force structures, and doctrines that Desert Storm had not developed. Junior officers who had watched technological warfare's triumph in 1991 found themselves as senior commanders fighting enemies who used improvised explosive devices, suicide attacks, and sectarian violence against which precision-guided munitions provided no solution. Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, whose cavalry troop had achieved legendary success at 73 Easting, led the recapture of Tal Afar, Iraq. In 2005, using counterinsurgency tactics that bore little resemblance to Desert Storm's methods, rather than destroying enemy forces from long range with technological superiority, McMaster's forces lived among Iraqi populations, partnered with local security forces, and conducted the patient, culturally informed operations that counterinsurgency required. The success at Tal Afar, like similar efforts in Ramadi and other cities, demonstrated that Desert Storm had prepared America's military for the wrong war. Technological dominance remained important, but political objectives required capabilities that precision strikes could not deliver. The debate about Desert Storm's legacy continued among military theorists, historians, and policymakers. Supporters argued that the conflict validated American military transformation and demonstrated what decisive victory could achieve. The overwhelming success restored American military credibility, enabled coalition building, and achieved clear objectives at minimal cost. Critics countered that Desert Storm created dangerous illusions about what military force could accomplish, encouraged interventionist policies, and left fundamental problems unresolved. The survival of Saddam Hussein's regime, requiring ongoing containment operations that eventually led to renewed conflict, suggested that Desert Storm's victory was incomplete. The humanitarian costs of sanctions and the regional instability that persisted complicated simplistic narratives of triumph. As of January 2026, Military analysts recognize Desert Storm as a pivotal moment when technology fundamentally altered conventional warfare's character. The integration of precision weapons, stealth technology, GPS navigation, real-time communications, and night vision capabilities created combat advantages that persist in American military doctrine. The lessons about joint operations, where air-ground, naval forces operated as synchronized instruments rather than competing services, reshaped military organization. The emphasis on training, professionalism, and all-volunteer forces validated the post-Vietnam transformation.